If you grew up in working-class Britain, the chances are a Littlewoods catalogue sat somewhere in your house, thick as a Bible, dog-eared at the corners, hidden under a cushion at Christmas so the children wouldn't see what was coming. And every Saturday at 4 o'clock, the room fell silent while Dad checked his pool's coupon. At its peak, Littlewoods employed 30,000 people and sent those catalogues to 1 in 3 British households. 10 million played the pools every week. It was the largest private company in Europe. They survived a Prime Minister's denunciation, survived the Football League trying to destroy the pools, survived 6 years of war when Liverpool women built bomber floors and packed parachutes on the same factory floor. And then, after more than 90 years, it vanished. How does a company that survived all of that simply disappear? What really happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Boy from the Church Inn. He came into the world above a pub. The Church Inn, Eccles, Lancashire, a brick-built public house on the edge of what was then still recognisably a mill town, surrounded by the chimneys and cobbles and low terraced roofs of industrial Manchester. The year was 1896. The month was January, and the boy who arrived on the 25th, John Moores, second of 8 children, eldest of 4 sons, would one day build the largest private company in Europe. But not yet, not for a very long time. His father, John William Moores, was a bricklayer. His mother, Louisa Fethney, had been a mill girl before she married, one of those women who worked the cotton frames from girlhood and carried the noise of the looms in their bones long after they left. It was a working life of the kind that Lancashire specialised in at the turn of the century. Hard, physical, tied to the seasons and the building trade. When work was good, the family ate. When it wasn't, they managed. There were 8 children to feed. The margins were measured in pennies. And then John William had an accident on site, the kind of injury that in 1900 carried no insurance, no compensation, no safety net beyond whatever your wife could borrow from the neighbours. He turned to drink, and when the drink took hold, he turned on Louisa. The young John Moores grew up in a house where violence arrived with the smell of beer on a man's breath. That's not a detail the later biographies dwell on. The trajectory from bricklayer's son to billionaire is a cleaner story without it. But it matters, because it shaped everything that followed. A boy who watches his father beat his mother develops one of 2 responses. He becomes the thing he witnessed, or he becomes its opposite. John Moores became its opposite, a man of obsessive self-control, meticulous organisation, and a rage for respectability that never quite left him. By 12, he was the family breadwinner, a milk round before school each morning, up in the dark, loading the cart, delivering to terraced houses in streets where the gas lamps were still lit, then walking to class with the smell of milk on his hands and the knowledge that if he didn't work, his younger brothers and sisters didn't eat. It was the kind of childhood that Victorian moralists like to frame as character building. For the boy living it, the lessons were simpler and harder. Money meant survival, and no one was going to hand it to you. He left elementary school in 1910, aged 14. His first job was as a messenger boy for the Manchester Post Office, running telegrams through the city streets, learning the geography of industrial Manchester at a pace that only a boy on foot truly absorbs. The cotton warehouses of Portland Street, the engineering works of Ancoats, the shipping offices along the canal. Manchester in 1910 was still the workshop of the world, or believed itself to be, and a messenger boy saw every floor of it, the counting houses and the loading bays, the boardrooms and the boiler rooms. He was sacked. The reason is lost to the record, but the fact itself matters. Here was a young man whose first encounter with institutional employment ended in failure. He would spend the rest of his life building institutions of his own. He retrained as a telegraphist, learning Morse code, mastering the rhythms of dots and dashes that connected the British Empire's commercial nervous system. It was skilled work, technical and demanding, and it suited a mind that thought in systems. When the war came in 1914, he served as a wireless operator in Aberdeen, spending the long years of the conflict in the grey granite city, monitoring signals from the North Sea, listening to the coded traffic of a world tearing itself apart. It was a solitary, technical posting, the kind that teaches patience and precision and gives a young man too much time to think about what he'll do when the uniforms come off. By 1918, he knew 2 things with certainty. He was good with systems, and he wanted to work for himself. He came to Liverpool in 1919. Not back. He'd never lived there before. to Liverpool drawn by a job with the Commercial Cable Company, one of the transatlantic telegraph firms whose cables ran beneath the Atlantic from the Mersey to New York. He was 23, unmarried, a Lancashire man in a port city that was still, just barely, one of the great commercial centres of the world. The docks stretched for 7 miles along the waterfront. The Cunard Building and the Liver Building dominated the pierhead. The Cotton Exchange still traded. The shipping lines still ran to every port in the empire. But the city's imperial confidence was already cracking at the edges. The war had broken something in the old mercantile order, and the men who came home from France and Flanders came home to a world that couldn't quite reassemble itself. Unemployment was rising. The casual labour system on the docks meant that thousands of men stood each morning at the pen, waiting to be picked for a day's work or sent home with nothing. Liverpool in 1919 was a city of magnificence and precariousness, and John Moores, lodging in rented rooms, working his shifts at the cable company, watched it with the eyes of a man who'd learned to read an economy from the inside. He sent and received cables. He watched the money move through the wires, and in October 1922, sitting in those same offices, he heard a story that would change everything, and with it, the city itself. Chapter 2, 35, Coupons. A man in Birmingham, John Jervis Barnard, had invented a new kind of betting game. The concept was simple and rather beautiful. You took the Saturday football fixtures, printed them on a coupon, and asked people to predict the results. The ones who got it right shared a pool of the entry money. Barnard called it a football pool. The idea was elegant. The execution was failing. Barnard couldn't find enough punters, couldn't process the coupons efficiently, couldn't make the mathematics of a tiny pool pay for the cost of printing and postage. The game was dying before it had properly lived. Moores was interested. 2 of his colleagues at the cable company were interested too. Colin Henry Littlewood Askham and Bill Hughes, both former messenger boys like himself. Both young men with appetites bigger than their wages. The 3 of them pooled their resources. £50 each. £150 in total, roughly 5,000 in today's money. Enough to print coupons, enough to hire a small office on Church Street, Liverpool, enough to try. But there was a problem. The Commercial Cable Company forbade its employees from running outside businesses. If the venture was traced back to them, they'd lose their jobs, their only source of income, the safety net beneath the gamble. They needed a name that couldn't be connected to any of them. Askham had a story. Orphaned in infancy, raised by an aunt whose surname he'd taken, he'd grown up as Askham but been born as something else entirely. His birth name, the name on the certificate that nobody used, the name of a family he'd never known, was Colin Henry Littlewood. It had a ring to it, professional, established, the kind of name you'd trust with your money. And on the 1st of February 1923, the Littlewood football pool was born, named after a man who'd never used the name, funded by 3 clerks who couldn't afford to lose their stake, modelled on a game invented by a Birmingham man who'd already failed at it. They rented a small office on Church Street, nothing more than a room with a table, a few chairs and whatever printing capacity £50 apiece could buy. The coupons were set in type at a local printer, run off in batches and stacked in boxes. The operation was tiny, handmade, improvised. It had the feeling of 3 men playing at being a company, which, in a sense, they were. The first test came on a Saturday afternoon in the winter of 1923, outside the gates of Old Trafford. 4,000 coupons, printed on cheap paper, handed out by the 3 men personally to the crowd filing in for Manchester United's home match. The idea needed no explanation. Every man in that crowd understood gambling, understood football, understood the alchemy of staking a small sum on the hope of a big return. What they didn't yet understand was this particular gamble, this unfamiliar coupon from an unfamiliar firm. 35 coupons came back. The total stake was £4, 7 shillings and 6pence. As a business proposition, it was closer to a humiliation than a beginning. They tried again. Hull, this time, a second distribution at a match in the East Riding. A single coupon was returned. 1 entry. 1 man in an entire football crowd who thought the Littlewood football pool was worth a few pennies and a stamp. By mid-season of 1924-25, each partner was £200 down, 400% of their original investment gone. Hughes wanted out. Askham wanted out. The arithmetic was unanswerable. They were three working men burning money they didn't have on a scheme that attracted fewer customers than a church raffle. £200 was not nothing. £200 was months of wages, carefully saved and methodically destroyed. Moores offered to buy them out. £200 each, the sum of their losses, returned in full. It was, by any measure, an act either of extraordinary conviction or extraordinary stubbornness. The difference between the two would take several years to establish, and here the story turns on a sentence spoken in a rented house in Liverpool. Ruby Knowles, whom Moores had married on the 19th of September 1923, just 7 months after the pools launched, watched her husband agonise over whether to continue alone. The venture was failing. Their savings were committed. He was a young husband with no safety net and a gambling operation that couldn't attract gamblers. She told him, "I would rather be married to a man who is haunted by failure than one haunted by regret." He paid out his partners. They took the money and walked away, into lives that history would not record. And John Moores, 28 years old, newly married, alone in a rented office on Church Street with unsold coupons and a wife's blessing, decided to keep going. What changed wasn't the product, it was the distribution. Moores stopped relying on matchday handouts and started using the postal system, the very infrastructure he'd spent his career working inside. He understood the mail. He understood its reach, its regularity, its penetration into every terraced street in industrial Britain. Coupons went out through the letterbox to addresses across the north. A man could fill in his predictions at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, post the coupon on Thursday morning, and wait for Saturday's results, with sixpence invested in the outcome. The pools moved from the turnstile to the letterbox, and in doing so, they moved from a curiosity to a weekly habit embedded in the rhythms of domestic life. The numbers turned. By 1926, the business was profitable. By 1928, profitable enough to fund Littlewoods printing, bringing coupon production in-house and cutting costs at a stroke. By 1929, when the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through British industry and unemployment climbed past 2 million, John Moores was employing dozens of people in Liverpool and processing tens of thousands of coupons a week. The pools, it turned out, were recession-proof. When times were hard, people didn't stop dreaming of a windfall. They needed it more. By 1930, aged 34, the bricklayer's son from Eccles was a millionaire. But he didn't build the pools alone. His brother Cecil, born the 10th of August 1902, 6 years younger, known to the entire workforce as the Chief, came into the business in its early years and stayed for decades. Cecil ran the pools operation with a personal authority that bordered on the patriarchal. His photograph appeared on the coupons themselves. His words of wisdom were printed alongside the fixtures each week, and for millions of British men who filled in their treble chants, Cecil Moores was the face of Littlewoods. Brothers Charlie and Arthur joined too. Sisters Hilda, Lou and Edna worked for the firm. The Moores family didn't just own Littlewoods. They were Littlewoods, a clan enterprise built on the model of the Lancashire mill families who'd preceded them, where blood and business and loyalty were the same thing. And the pools survived a direct political assault that would have killed a less stubborn enterprise. In 1929, Moores was prosecuted under the Ready Money Football Betting Act, a Victorian-era statute designed to suppress working-class gambling. He was convicted. He appealed. The conviction was overturned. The pools were legal, but the establishment's hostility didn't stop at the courtroom. Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, denounced the pools from the dispatch box as a sinister disease which spread downwards to the industrious poor from the idle rich. It was a remarkable sentence, remarkable because it got the direction of travel exactly backwards. The pools hadn't spread down from the idle rich. They'd spread up from a bricklayer's son with £50 and a packet of coupons. The Prime Minister of Great Britain had misread his own country. Then, in 1936, came the Pools War. The Football League, alarmed by the growth of pools betting, refused to publish its fixture lists in advance, hoping to kill the industry by denying it the raw material of the game. Moores fought back, deploying scouts to matches and using newspaper tipsters to reconstruct the fixtures independently. The league backed down within weeks. It was the second time in a decade that the British establishment had tried to destroy the pools, and the second time the pools had won. By now, John Moores wasn't just running a gambling operation. He was thinking bigger, and his next idea, the one that would turn a Liverpool betting firm into the largest private company in Europe, would be aimed not at the men who filled in the coupons, but at the women who put up with them. Chapter 3. The Wish Book. The football pools had a structural limitation that kept Moores thinking. They appealed, overwhelmingly, to men. The coupon came through the letterbox. Dad filled it in at the kitchen table. Dad posted it back. And Dad, if fortune smiled on a Saturday afternoon, collected the winnings. Mum might tolerate the weekly flutter. She might even check the results for him while he was at the pub. But the pools were a male ritual, rooted in football and the language of odds, and Moores understood that a business built on half the population had a ceiling he'd eventually hit. In January 1932, he did something about it. He launched a mail-order catalogue. The idea wasn't original. Sears Roebuck had been doing it in America for 4 decades, and Moores had visited the United States specifically to study their operation. The warehouse logistics, the credit systems, the staggering scale of catalogue distribution across an entire continent. But British mail order was different from American mail order in one critical respect that Moores grasped immediately. Sears sold to isolated rural customers who had no shops within 100 miles. British customers had shops on every high street, markets on every Saturday, co-op stores within walking distance. Convenience wasn't the gap. The gap was something more fundamental. Credit. Not bank credit. Not hire purchase, with its intimidating paperwork and its shopfront stigma. Something more intimate, more human, and infinitely more powerful. The Littlewoods catalogue operated through a club system, a social technology so elegantly designed that it would take the internet 70 years to replicate its essential logic. A local woman would sign up as an agent. She'd recruit 10 or 20 neighbours, friends, sisters-in-law, women from the same street, the same church, the same factory canteen. Each member paid the agent a small sum each week, 6pence, a shilling, half a crown. The agent placed orders from the catalogue on their behalf, on credit extended by Littlewoods. Goods arrived at her door in brown paper parcels. She distributed them along the street. She collected the weekly payments, and she earned a commission, typically a few % of everything her club spent. It was, at its heart, a peer-to-peer credit network running on female trust. In an era when working-class families had no bank accounts, no overdrafts, and no access to the formal lending system that the middle classes took for granted, the Littlewoods catalogue was how you bought school shoes in September, a winter coat when the cold came, a bicycle for Christmas, a record player for the front room, eventually a refrigerator, a washing machine, a television set. You didn't need to walk into a bank and explain yourself to a man in a suit. You needed to know Jean at number 47, and Jean needed to trust that you'd keep up your payments. The entire system ran on social capital, on the bonds between women who lived in the same streets, whose children went to the same schools, who saw each other every day and couldn't afford to default because the shame would follow them to the corner shop. The agent's commission, sometimes a few shillings a week, sometimes more as her club grew, was often the only money she earned in her own name. In an economy that still assumed women's work was unpaid domestic labour or supplementary factory wages, handed straight to the household purse, the Littlewoods agent had her own income, her own customers, her own small enterprise. She was, without anyone calling her so, an entrepreneur. The catalogue itself became a cultural object that transcended its commercial function. Working-class families called it the Wish Book. It arrived in autumn, thick as a Bible, heavy as a promise, crammed with photographs of things you couldn't yet afford but could imagine owning. Children turned the pages with a reverence normally reserved for Christmas annuals. They folded down the corners, the Raleigh chopper on page 247, the Scalextric set on page 312, the Tiny Tears doll with the real tears. Mothers hid the catalogue under a sofa cushion in November so the children wouldn't see what was being ordered for Christmas. Catalogues passed between sisters and cousins like contraband. Have you seen what's in the new Littlewoods? Pages were traced with tracing paper. Toy guns and dolls were copied in pencil by small hands that understood wanting before they understood money. The agent collected on Fridays. The catalogue was the Friday conversation. Who'd ordered what, whose curtains had arrived, whether the sizing ran small this season. It was commerce woven into gossip, credit woven into community, aspiration woven into the fabric of streets where the front door was never locked and the backyard was common ground. Turnover hit £100,000 in year one. 400,000 in year 2. By early 1936, the mail-order operation was turning over £4 million a year. Moores had sent the first catalogues to existing pool subscribers. Men's addresses, repurposed to reach their wives. It was a masterpiece of cross-selling, decades before the term existed. He'd found his second market, and this time it was women. The third leg of the empire followed swiftly. On the 6th of July 1937, the first Littlewoods department store opened in Blackpool, a seaside town that understood spectacle, spending money, and the pleasures of browsing. It worked. More stores followed across industrial Britain, each one a mid-market department store aimed at the same families who filled in their pools coupons and ordered from the catalogue. By 1939, there were 24 Littlewoods stores on British high streets, and Mr. John, as his workforce knew him, never Mr. Moores, never boss, just Mr. John, was running a three-pronged empire that touched almost every working-class family in the country. The form of address mattered. It was simultaneously intimate and hierarchical, a Lancashire habit, rooted in mill culture where the owner was the owner and the hands were the hands, but where the distances were measured in yards rather than miles. Mr. John walked the floors. Mr. John knew names. He expected standards, punctuality, cleanliness, loyalty, and in return he paid wages that, in a city defined by casual dock labour and irregular work, were considered the best in Liverpool. The name was a quiet irony that nobody outside the company knew. The man who'd lent it, Colin Ascombe, born Littlewood, had walked away with his £200 years earlier. The business bearing his birth name had made his former partner a millionaire many times over. It's the kind of detail that, had it surfaced at the time, might have made a newspaper story. It never did. Moores was also, and this matters for the inheritance that would one day destroy the company, a Conservative, a councillor for the Sefton parish from 1933 to 1940, a parliamentary candidate at Clay Cross in 1933 and Nuneaton in 1935, both times unsuccessfully, an amateur footballer who played until he was 40, an amateur painter, a baseball enthusiast who loved the sport enough to fund a Liverpool Baseball League in 1933, donate the John Moores Trophy in 1938, and earn posthumous induction into the British Baseball Hall of Fame in 2009. He lived from 1930 until his death at Fairways, a large house on Shireburn Road in Freshfield, Formby, far enough from Edge Lane to be respectable, close enough to Liverpool to be present. By 1939, the Littlewoods empire employed thousands, turned over millions, and was growing faster than the economy around it. And then the world went to war, and Mr. John's dream factory was repurposed for something else entirely. Chapter 4. Barrage Balloons and Halifax Floors. The building that would become the heart of the Littlewoods empire, and, decades later, its most haunting ruin, opened in 1938 on Edge Lane, Liverpool. Gerald de Courcy Fraser designed it, a Scottish architect whose portfolio included several Lewis's department stores, a man who understood how to make commercial architecture speak with civic authority. What he built was a 260,000 square foot Art Deco palace, white-rendered concrete, clean geometric lines, a central clock tower visible across the rooftops of East Liverpool. Two long, symmetrical wings stretched from the tower like outstretched arms. The internal space was wide enough to drive a lorry through. It sat on the edge of Wavertree Botanic Park, overlooking the road that would one day become the city's gateway from the M62, and from the moment it opened, it was the most recognisable industrial building in Liverpool, a factory that looked like a monument, built for a business that was beginning to feel like an institution. The building was designed for pools. The vast floors were laid out for rows of women sitting at long tables, checking coupons by hand, a human assembly line of prediction and verification, processing the weekly hopes of millions of men across Britain. Each coupon had to be opened, read, cross-referenced against the Saturday results, scored, and filed. The work was repetitive, exacting, and performed at a speed that demanded both concentration and endurance. The building was barely a year old, the routines barely established, the workforce barely settled into the rhythms of the place, when everything changed. On the 5th of September 1939, 2 days after Neville Chamberlain's broadcast to the nation, the government requisitioned the Edge Lane building. The women who checked coupons were sent home. The coupons stopped arriving, and into that vast Art Deco shell moved MC5, the Postal Censorship Department. The work was secret, and it would remain so for decades after the war ended. What happened inside Edge Lane during those years was not Bletchley Park. It was not enigma, not code-breaking in the mathematical sense that would later become the stuff of films and novels. MC5's work was more physical, more forensic, and, in its own way, more intimate. Staff intercepted mail to and from suspected enemy agents operating in Britain and across occupied Europe. They opened letters with steam and precision. They read them. They photographed them. They resealed them with such care that the recipient would never know they'd been touched. And in the basement air raid shelters, graphic specialists forged alterations in intercepted correspondence, changing a word here, a figure there, a meeting place, a date, feeding disinformation back through the enemy's own postal network, with handwriting so convincing that the forgery and the original were indistinguishable. It was espionage conducted with scissors, paste, a magnifying glass, and a steady hand. Many of the MC5 staff were the same Liverpool women who'd been checking pools coupons the month before. The skills transferred with an eerie precision, the attention to detail, the patience with repetitive close work, the ability to process large volumes of correspondence without error. Painted on the concrete walls of those basement shelters, surviving to this day, are portraits of men and women in wartime helmets, possibly the work of an MC5 graphic artist who used the same forgery skills in portraiture. They stare out from the concrete with the composed, slightly startled expression of people who knew that what they were doing mattered and couldn't tell anyone about it. Meanwhile, the building's printing presses, the same machines that had churned out millions of pools coupons, were turned to a task whose scale still startles. In 3 days, the Littlewoods presses produced 17 million national registration forms. 3 days, 17 million documents. It was the administrative backbone of Britain's wartime identity system, printed at a speed that would test a modern digital operation, delivered by a workforce that had pivoted from gambling slips to government infrastructure in a matter of weeks. But Edge Lane was only one building. Across 16 other requisitioned Littlewoods premises, the workforce, still overwhelmingly female, retrained for war production on a scale that defied every assumption about what women in a catalogue company could do. From 1940, they made barrage balloons, vast silver-grey inflatables that hung over British cities to deter low-flying bombers, each one assembled by hand from rubberized fabric panels, cut, glued and pressure-tested by women who'd previously sorted mail-order parcels and sealed envelopes. In 1941 came dinghies and munitions. In 1942, aircraft parts and bridge sections, the structural components of military engineering, fabricated in buildings designed for retail storage. In 1943, storm boats for the Allied river crossings that would carry soldiers across the waterways of occupied Europe. And throughout it all, the major production lines ran: Wellington bomber fuselages, parachutes, each one packed by hand, each one a life in silk and cord. The floors of Handley Page Halifax, heavy bombers, the 4-engined aircraft that carried the RAF's strategic bombing campaign deep into Germany, every one of them flying on wooden floors assembled by women in Liverpool. 12 million shells, 6 million fuses. The figures belong to the literature of total war, the kind of production statistics that make you recalibrate what a civilian workforce, mostly female, mostly recruited from the terraced streets of Merseyside, could accomplish when the work was urgent and the cause was beyond argument. The building also housed Unity pools, the wartime government-mandated amalgamation of Littlewoods, Vernon's and Zetta's, the 3 great pools firms, merged for the duration so that the betting infrastructure could continue without consuming the resources that 3 separate operations would demand. The government had decided, with characteristic British pragmatism, that morale was worth a flutter. A working man needed his pools coupon the way he needed his cigarettes and his pint. It was a small stake against the universe, a weekly act of optimism in a world that offered few reasons for it. So Unity pools ran inside the same building as the censorship operation and the munitions production, staffed by the same women doing all 3 jobs on rotating shifts. It was a peculiarly British arrangement: espionage, gambling and bomb-making under one Art Deco roof. John Moores emerged from the war with something more valuable than any military contract: a tested workforce of extraordinary scale and capability. Thousands of Liverpool women had been trained, managed and deployed across 16 sites. They knew the buildings. They knew the rhythms of industrial production. They knew each other, the bonds of wartime work running as deep as any factory floor camaraderie in the history of British industry. And when the war ended and the government handed back the requisitioned premises, Moores had a ready-made labour force and a city full of women who already thought of Littlewoods as their place. They'd built bombers and sealed parachutes and forged letters for the Secret Service. Going back to checking Pool's coupons and packing catalogue parcels was, in one sense, a step down. In another, it was a homecoming to the building they knew, the work they understood, and the wages that had kept their families fed through the worst years of the century. The post-war expansion was swift and broad. The Pools roared back into peacetime life. By 1947, Pool's revenue across the entire industry stood at £70 million a year, with over 90% of that money spent at just 4 operators: Littlewoods, Vernon's, Sherman's and Cope's. Littlewoods was by far the largest. The post office was handling nearly 15 million Pools packets a week, an almost incomprehensible volume of mail, a river of penny coupons and sixpenny stakes flowing into Liverpool from every corner of industrial Britain. The catalogue came back too, feeding a nation starved of consumer goods by 6 years of rationing and austerity. Families who'd spent the war making do, patching clothes, sleeping under blackout curtains, now opened the Littlewoods catalogue and saw a peacetime world laid out in photographs: new furniture, new fabrics, new appliances, all available on credit through the club system that hadn't lost a single agent during the war. The stores multiplied. By 1952, there were over 50 Littlewoods department stores on British high streets, each one a bright mid-market emporium aimed at the families who couldn't afford Harrods or Selfridges but wanted something better than the Co-op. Littlewoods stores sold clothing, homeware, toys, cosmetics, electrical goods, a department for every room in the house and every member of the family. They weren't glamorous, they weren't fashionable. They were reliable, affordable, and present on every major shopping street from Glasgow to Plymouth. Competitors fell or were absorbed. Moores acquired Sherman's of Cardiff, a significant Welsh pools operator, in June 1961, eliminating a regional rival and extending the Littlewoods pools operation into South Wales. Vernon's and Zetta's remained independent, but smaller, permanent shadows in Littlewoods' wake. In the mail-order market, great universal stores, Grattan, Freeman's and Kay's, competed for the same working-class households, but none of them could match Littlewoods' unique advantage: the Pool's subscriber list. Every man who filled in a coupon was a household. Every household was a potential catalogue customer. Every catalogue customer was a potential store visitor. The 3 divisions fed each other in a virtuous cycle that no competitor could replicate, because no competitor had all 3. And the company embraced technology with a zeal that belied its penny coupon origins. Littlewoods was among the first British companies to install IBM computers in the post-war years, recognizing that the processing of millions of coupons and millions of catalogue orders demanded something beyond human arithmetic. By 1961, the company had installed high-speed optical scanners for pools checking. By 1967, it was using optical character recognition to identify client coupons automatically. For a business built on door-to-door credit and hand-checked betting slips, the technological ambition was startling. But Moores had always been a systems man. He'd learned Morse code before he was 20. He'd built his empire on the postal system. He understood that infrastructure was the invisible architecture of commercial dominance, and he invested in it with the instinct of an engineer. By the early 1960s, the bricklayer's son from the church inn presided over an empire that stretched across 3 divisions, employed tens of thousands, dominated every market it entered, and was growing faster than the British economy around it. The boy who'd run a milk round at 12, who'd been sacked from the post office, who'd watched 35 coupons come back from 4,000. That boy had built something that Lancashire had never quite seen before. Not a mill, not a mine, not a shipyard, but a machine for selling dreams. Dreams of a Pools win on Saturday afternoon. Dreams of a winter coat from the catalogue. Dreams of a 3-piece suite bought on credit and paid off at £1 a week. He'd built the infrastructure of aspiration for working-class Britain, and the women of Liverpool, tens of thousands of them, eventually, were the ones who made it run. The golden age was about to begin. And it would be magnificent. Chapter 5. Mr. John's Empire. If you'd arrived for the morning shift at the Edge Lane Pools building in the mid-1960s, walked up from the bus stop on the main road, crossed the car park in your coat, joined the stream of women converging from every direction, the first thing you'd have noticed was the scale. 260,000 square feet of white Art Deco concrete, the clock tower marking the time for the whole district, the two long wings stretching away on either side like the outstretched arms of something too large to take in from the ground. It looked like a civic monument. It felt, on a Monday morning with the crowd pressing through the doors, like a small city coming to life. You'd have heard it before you saw the inside. A low hum that built as you moved through the corridors. Not machinery exactly, but movement. The sound of several thousand women settling into their places, pulling their chairs to the tables, arranging their tools. Because the pool's floors, when you stepped onto them, were vast. Long tables set in rows that seemed to run the full length of the building, each one seating dozens of women working shoulder to shoulder. The coupons arrived in sacks from the post office, millions of them each week, sorted by region, stacked in bundles, distributed along the tables in batches. Each woman opened a coupon, read the handwritten predictions, cross-referenced them against the Saturday football results printed on the master sheet, scored the entry, and placed it in the correct tray. Correct. Incorrect. Borderline. The work was repetitive, exacting, and performed at a speed that astonished every outsider who witnessed it. Hands moving in a rhythm that had been learned over months and perfected over years. These women weren't clerks sitting at desks. They were human processors. Hands and eyes and concentration trained to a pitch that machines wouldn't match for decades. Littlewoods had installed IBM computers and optical scanners by the early 1960s, making it one of the first companies in Britain to computerize at scale. By 1961, high-speed optical scanners checked the coupons that the women had already scored, providing a verification layer that caught errors before the prize calculations began. By 1967, Littlewoods was using optical character recognition, OCR, to identify client coupons automatically, reading the printed names and addresses at a speed that would have taken a roomful of typists a week. For a company that had started with handwritten coupons at Old Trafford, the technological ambition was remarkable, but the machines didn't replace the women. They couldn't. The sheer volume of the operation, 10 million coupons a week at peak, many of them handwritten by men whose penmanship ranged from careful copperplate to something approaching abstract art, demanded what no scanner of the 1960s could provide: the judgment to read a smudged entry, to decode a number that had been written over, to identify a coupon that had been fraudulently altered. The women provided the intelligence. The machines provided the arithmetic. Together, they processed a volume of weekly correspondence that rivaled the output of a government department. Wednesday was running off day, the day the addressograph machine stamped the outgoing envelopes. The workers called the machine the Joey. It embossed the name and address of each client onto a small metal plate, then hammered that plate against the envelope with a percussive force that rattled the bones of every woman in the room. The noise was industrial, mechanical, violent, a rhythmic slamming that filled the building from end to end and went on for hours. Former workers compared it to their memories of the wartime bombing. Like being bombed again, one recalled, and for women who'd spent the war making munitions and assembling Halifax bomber floors in the same building, the comparison was not casual. The Joey ran all day on a Wednesday. The building shook with it. And alongside the Joey, women using rubber thumbs, small rubber caps fitted over the thumb and forefinger for grip, filled envelopes with coupons at a speed that no mechanical process of the era could match. Hands and rubber and paper, moving in a blur that visitors found mesmerizing, and the women themselves found unremarkable. It was simply what they did. It was simply how fast they could do it. The workforce at peak numbered approximately 30,000. They were known, affectionately and universally, as Littlewoodies. The name belonged to them, not imposed from above, not invented by a marketing department, but grown from the inside, the way nicknames grow in any workplace where people spend decades side by side. And in Liverpool, the word carried a social weight that outsiders sometimes failed to grasp. To be a Littlewoodie was to have a permanent job in a city where permanent jobs for women were rare, underpaid, and often dangerous. The docks employed men, casually, irregularly, at the mercy of the morning pen, where foremen chose who worked that day and sent the rest home with nothing. Factories employed women too, but the conditions were uneven. and the pay was often poor. Littlewoods, by every surviving testimony, paid the best wage in Liverpool, and it came with paid holidays, a benefit that was far from universal in the 1950s and 60s. It came with a permanent contract, not the casual arrangements that dominated much of the city's economy. For a Liverpool woman in 1960, a job at Littlewoods was not just employment. It was respectability. It was a wage packet that arrived every Friday without fail, that could be relied upon, that made the difference between managing and going under. The women who worked the pool's floor earned enough to keep a household going when their husbands were between jobs on the docks, and in Liverpool, between jobs on the docks could mean weeks, sometimes months. The Littlewoods wage was the steady income in a city of unsteady incomes, and the women who earned it knew exactly what it was worth. Joan Boyce started at Littlewoods in 1950, aged 15, at the Earlham Road building in Bootle, one of the satellite sites that supplemented the main Edge Lane operation. She would spend decades with the company, and later, in retirement, set about collecting the oral histories of scores of former Littlewoods workers. The result was a book, Littlewoods Pools Girls, published by Writing on the Wall in 2021. Her central finding was a sentence that sounds like exaggeration until you understand the demographics of post-war Merseyside. In Liverpool, almost every woman either worked in the pools or had a mother, aunt, or sister who worked there. The pools provided, Joan wrote, regular stable employment for women in a city blighted by casual work and unemployment, where women's work tended to be irregular, dirty, unsafe, or demeaning. It wasn't an overstatement. It was a description of an employer so large, so embedded in the fabric of a single city, that its workforce and its community were functionally the same thing. Lynn McCarrick, who worked at Littlewoods in the 1960s, framed it differently but reached the same conclusion. Littlewoods is in the DNA of many generations in this country. Everyone knows, or knows of, someone who worked there. Her testimony reached beyond Liverpool. The catalogue agents, the store staff, the warehouse workers spread across dozens of British towns. But the heart of it was always Merseyside, where a family without a Littlewoods connection was the exception rather than the rule. The terms of employment went beyond the wage packet in ways that were unusual for their time and remarkable for a private company. Littlewoods ran a subsidised canteen where the food was hot and cheap. Proper meals, not sandwiches, with tea poured from urns that never ran dry. The smell of frying bacon drifted through the corridors on the breakfast shift. At lunchtime, the canteen hosted concert party entertainment, singing, dancing, comedians, not recorded music or a radio turned up loud, but live performance. Women from the workforce got up on a small stage and performed for their colleagues. Songs from the musicals, comedy sketches, dancing in pairs. It was workplace entertainment of a kind that had its roots in the wartime Ensa tradition, and it survived at Littlewoods long after most British factories had replaced the concert party with a vending machine and a television in the corner. There were in-house sports teams, netball, rounders, swimming, and choirs and amateur dramatic groups that rehearsed after shifts and performed to audiences of colleagues and families. There were mass annual outings to seaside resorts, coaches leaving Edge Lane in convoy, hundreds of women heading for Blackpool or Southport or Llandudno, on a works trip that was also a day of freedom from the kitchen and the demands of the house. In a city where women's leisure was an afterthought, squeezed between childcare, housework, and the expectations of husbands who wanted their tea on the table at 5. The Littlewoods social calendar was a rare space where women gathered on their own terms, in their own numbers, for their own enjoyment. The friendships formed on the pool's floor lasted lifetimes. The bonds of shared work, the in-jokes, the rivalries between tables, the collective groan when the Joey started up on a Wednesday morning, were as deep as anything the city produced. And Littlewoods was ahead of the curve on equal opportunities, in ways that only became visible in retrospect. John Moores Jr., Sir John's son, chaired the Littlewoods Equal Opportunities Strategy Committee from the mid-1960s to October 1996. In the 1980s, the company ran a pioneering training scheme that offered structured routes into employment for people who might otherwise have been shut out. One beneficiary was Malik Al-Nasir, a care-experienced young black Liverpudlian who joined Littlewoods and was given the opportunity to attend college one day a week, alongside his job. He later became a poet, author, and academic. a trajectory that began with a Littlewoods training placement. The scheme didn't make national headlines. It wasn't designed to. It was simply a company doing, quietly and systematically, what Mr. John's founding ethos demanded. If you offered people a structure, people would do the work. The employment was multi-generational in a way that no modern company can easily replicate. A woman who started on the pool's floor at 15 in 1950 might still be working at Littlewoods in 1985, and by then her daughter would be working alongside her and her granddaughter would be starting as a school leaver. 3 generations in the same building, doing versions of the same work, drawing wages from the same payroll. The knowledge passed not through training manuals, but through families. A mother showing her daughter how to sort coupons, how to use the rubber thumbs, how to read the Joey's rhythm and protect your ears. It produced a workforce of extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary depth, and it meant that when the redundancies came, decades later, they wouldn't cut through a company. They'd cut through families. The rhythm of the building was the rhythm of the city. The works hooter sounded at the start of each shift, and you could hear it streets away, across the terraced roofs of Wavertree and Old Swan, through the open windows of houses where women were putting on their coats and checking the clock. They walked in together, worked together, ate together, walked home together. Along streets where the neighbours knew you worked at Littlewoods because their mother worked at Littlewoods, their sister worked at Littlewoods, the woman 3 doors down worked at Littlewoods. The boundary between workplace and community was so thin as to be invisible. The wages that Littlewoods paid out each Friday went straight into the local economy, into the shops on County Road, into the rent, into the catalogue payments collected by the agent at number 47. The money circulated through Merseyside the way blood circulates through a body, and the heart that pumped it was a white Art Deco building on Edge Lane with a clock tower that kept time for the district and a workforce of women who kept time for each other. Chapter 6. Spend, spend, spend. The game that sustained everything, the treble chance, was a thing of elegant simplicity. You studied the Saturday football fixtures, printed on the coupon that arrived through your letterbox each week. You picked 8 matches most likely to end as score draws. 1-1, 2-2, 3-3. You filled in the coupon with a pencil, sealed it in the envelope provided, posted it with your stake, 3p, 6p, a shilling, and waited for 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, when the classified football results were read aloud on BBC Grandstand, in a cadence so distinctive, so measured, so deeply embedded in the national rhythm, that it became the sound of the weekend itself. The results reader's voice was flat, unhurried, deliberate. Each result was delivered in the same monotone, the rising or falling inflection on the away team's score the only clue to whether the match had been a draw or a rout. In millions of living rooms across Britain, Dad sat forward. The coupon sat on the arm of the chair. The pencil was ready. And for 3 or 4 minutes, the whole house fell silent while the scores came in and the crosses were checked against the predictions. Children knew not to speak. Mum paused the washing up. The dog, if the household had one, learned to lie still. The 4 o'clock silence was as much a part of Saturday as match of the day was a part of Saturday night. It was a national ritual built on small stakes and enormous hopes, and Littlewoods sat at the centre of it like a spider at the centre of a web spun from penny coupons and 6-penny dreams. 10 million people a week played the football pools at their peak. 10 million, not 10 million over a season or a year. 10 million every single week, staking a few pence each, filling in coupons at kitchen tables from Inverness to Penzance, posting them back to Liverpool in envelopes that the post office processed by the sackload. The entire operation ran on the Royal Mail, 15 million pools, packets a week through the postal system at peak, a river of paper flowing into Edge Lane that required its own sorting infrastructure, its own delivery schedules, its own accommodation with the GPO. The most famous winner never recovered from winning. Viv Nicholson was a 25-year-old licorice factory worker from Castleford, Yorkshire, a mining town in the West Riding where the women worked the factories and the men worked the coalface, and the horizons were measured in streets, not miles. Her husband Keith was a miner. He'd filled in the Littlewoods coupon the way millions of men did, without particular expectation, more habit than hope. On the 23rd of September 1961, his 8 draws came in. The prize was £152,319 and 8 shillings, roughly 3 million in today's money. The cheque was presented by Bruce Forsyth on live television. Reporters crowded around Viv, microphones extended, cameras rolling. They asked her what she planned to do with the fortune. She answered in 3 words that entered the English language and never left. Spend, spend, spend. She meant it. Every syllable. Furs, cars, holidays, champagne. A lifestyle that Castleford had never seen and that Castleford's money couldn't sustain. Keith Nicholson died in 1965, driving his Jaguar too fast on the A1. He was 29. The money followed him, burned through in a blaze of spending that left Viv destitute, bankrupt, and eventually homeless. Her autobiography was published. A play for today was made in 1977, directed by John Goldschmidt, and won a BAFTA. A musical followed. Morrissey borrowed her image and a line from her autobiography for a Smith's record sleeve, the Pools winner as cultural icon, tragedy dressed in leopard print. Viv Nicholson became a parable, but her ruin, paradoxically, only strengthened the Pools' appeal. If Viv could win, anyone could win, and the lesson most people drew was not "don't play," but "I'd handle it differently." A quarter of a century later, in 1986, a different kind of Pools story emerged. Nurse Sister Margaret Francis and 10 of her colleagues at a hospital in Devizes, Wiltshire, shared the first Pools payout to exceed £1 million. 1,017,890. It was a syndicate win. Sensible women, steady jobs, pooled stakes, shared reward. The anti-Viv. The Pools could produce both stories, both cautionary tales and fairy tales, and both kept the coupons selling. The dream was portable. It fitted into any life. The Pools were not just a gambling product. They were a social infrastructure, a weekly conversation that connected millions of people who had nothing else in common. The man on the factory floor in Coventry and the bus driver in Newcastle and the retired postman in Dorset all filled in the same coupon, checked the same results, shared the same irrational hope. In pubs across Britain on Saturday evenings, the Pools were discussed with the seriousness of a cabinet meeting. Which draws had come in, which hadn't, who'd been one result away from a fortune. The near miss was almost as powerful as the win. A man who'd predicted 7 draws out of 8 carried his coupon in his wallet for weeks, showing it to anyone who'd look. The Pools gave ordinary people a stake in Saturday, a reason to care about football results that had no bearing on their team, a reason to listen to the scores with the intensity of a surgeon monitoring a heartbeat. And running alongside the Pools, the Catalogue empire grew until it occupied a space in British domestic life that no single retailer has matched since. By the early 1980s, Littlewoods was not merely the dominant Pools operator. It was, by several measures, the dominant private enterprise in the United Kingdom. In 1982, the company was the largest private company in Europe. Annual profits approached £100 million. The mail-order catalogue had reached a peak distribution of 25 million copies, landing on the doormat of roughly 1 in 3 British households, making it the most widely distributed publication in Britain after the telephone directory. The stores numbered 120, fulfilling Sir John's long-held target and stretching from Glasgow to Plymouth. Combined annual sales across all 3 divisions reached £2,370 million in the early 90s. Competing mail-order firms, Great Universal Stores, Grattan, Freeman's, Kay's, occupied portions of the same market, but none could match the breadth. Littlewoods uniquely combined Pools, Catalogue and high street retail in a single integrated operation, each division feeding customers to the others in a cycle that no competitor could replicate because no competitor had all 3 parts. And the catalogue's reach extended beyond commerce into something closer to cultural infrastructure. By the 1970s and 80s, agents numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Britain, women in every town, every estate, every terrace, running their clubs with ledger books and pencil stubs and the accumulated trust of years. The credit they extended, small sums, paid back weekly, managed through handwritten records and personal knowledge of who could pay and who was struggling, was, for millions of families, the only credit system they had access to. Not a bank loan with its intimidating forms and its suited officials, not a credit card, which most working-class families wouldn't hold until the 1990s. A woman down the street who knew your name, knew your children, knew whether you'd had a good week or a bad one, and trusted you to keep up your payments because she'd see you at the school gates on Monday morning. The entire system ran on social capital, on the bonds between women in communities where reputation was currency, where a defaulted payment would follow you to the corner shop, and where trust was the only collateral anyone had. It was as close to a mutual society as any commercial enterprise in post-war Britain, and Littlewoods sat at the centre of it, processing the payments, dispatching the parcels, earning the margins, while the women did the work of holding the network together. Chapter 7. The Littlewoods Cup. Sir John Moores was knighted in 1980. He was 84 years old, and the honour was overdue by any reasonable measure. The man who'd built the largest private company in Europe, employed 30,000 people, founded Britain's most prestigious painting prize, and bankrolled Everton Football Club through its greatest era, had waited longer for his knighthood than men who'd achieved a fraction of what he had. He retired from the chairmanship of Littlewoods that same year, handing control to John Clement, the first non-family chairman recruited from Unigate, the dairy conglomerate. Clement in turn brought in Sir Desmond Pitcher, a Liverpudlian and former Plessy Communications executive, as Group Chief Executive. The old man stepped back. The professionals stepped forward, and the shareholders' investment, valued at £753 million in 1982, appeared to be in steady hands. Moore's civic footprint, by this point, had become indistinguishable from Liverpool's identity. The John Moores Painting Prize, founded in 1957 with Hugh Scruton, director of the Walker Art Gallery, was by now an established institution, the most prestigious biennial contemporary painting competition in Britain, attracting entries from across the world. David Hockney had won in 1967 with Peter Getting Out of Nick's Pool, a painting that became one of the defining images of British pop art. Earlier, laureates included Roger Hilton, Jack Smith, and William Scott. The prize put Liverpool at the centre of British contemporary art. Not London, not Edinburgh, but Liverpool, because a self-made millionaire who'd started with a milk round, loved painting, and believed his city deserved better than its reputation for decline. His football legacy was equally indelible. Moores had become chairman of Everton in June 1961 and immediately transformed the club into the Mersey Millionaires, bankrolling a decade of success that rivalled anything in the club's history. And on the 14th of April 1961, in a moment that would enter football folklore as both ruthless and faintly absurd, he sacked Everton's manager Johnny Carey in the back of a London taxi after a match. Harry Catterick was appointed as replacement. The phrase "taxi for Carey," or simply "taxi for," followed by the name of any doomed manager, became the standard metaphor for a managerial dismissal in English football, and it originated with a Pools millionaire in the back seat of a black cab. He attended the FA Cup finals of 1984, 1985 and 1986, all featuring Everton. He was in his late 80s by then, frail, immaculate, present. And in 1992, Liverpool Polytechnic was renamed Liverpool John Moores University, making him the only person in the United Kingdom to have a university named after them while still alive. The messenger boy who'd been sacked from the post office at 14 had, by 96, a university, a painting prize, a football dynasty, and the largest private company in Europe bearing his name. In 1987, Littlewoods sponsored the League Cup. The trophy that year was the Littlewoods Cup. The final was played at Wembley, won by Arsenal. And there, in front of the television cameras and 80,000 spectators, Sir John Moores, 91 years old, stooped but steady, presented the trophy bearing his company's name to the winning captain. The image was broadcast to millions. It was the zenith, the absolute summit, the moment when the Littlewoods name appeared not just on the coupons and the catalogues and the shop fronts and the Edge Lane clock tower, but on the trophy itself, held aloft at Wembley, gleaming under the floodlights. Now consider what was happening beneath the surface. The high street was fragmenting. Out-of-town shopping centres, Merry Hill in the West Midlands, the Metro Centre in Gateshead, Meadowhall outside Sheffield, the Trafford Centre west of Manchester, were drawing customers away from the town centre locations where Littlewoods stores had traded for half a century. Littlewoods opened a new flagship at Merry Hill on the 14th of November 1989, chasing the migration, but the chain remained what it had always been, a mid-market, mid-price department store with no sharp identity. It wasn't the quality of Marks and Spencer, where women went for reliable knitwear and dependable food. It wasn't the cheapness of Woolworths, where children spent their pocket money on pick and mix. It wasn't the homeware focus of BHS. It was everything and nothing. A department store for families who'd always shopped at Littlewoods because their mothers had always shopped at Littlewoods. Loyalty was its product. And loyalty, in a changing retail landscape where choice was multiplying and habit was weakening, was a product with a limited shelf life. The catalogue was exposed in a different way. Phone orders had partly displaced the club agents through the 1980s, but the catalogue itself, and the 8-week dispatch cycle that came with it, was structurally vulnerable to anything faster. The first hint of the internet was years away from the living room, but the logic of instant ordering and next-day delivery was already emerging in competitor models. The Littlewoods catalogue, for all its cultural power, was a Victorian social technology refined for a mid-century economy. It had not fundamentally changed since John Moores posted his first one to pool subscribers in 1932. And inside Whitehall, a plan was taking shape that would strike at the very foundation of the Littlewoods empire. John Major's government was developing a national lottery, a weekly draw, televised on BBC One, with jackpots that made the pools look like a church collection. The lottery would be available to anyone who walked into a newsagent and bought a ticket for £1. No coupons to fill in, no football knowledge required, no 8-draw permutations to calculate, no maths at all. Just pick 6 numbers, hand over your money, and watch the draw on Saturday evening with Anthea Turner and Mystic Meg, and the machine they called Guinevere spinning numbered balls into a perspex tube. The National Lottery would offer everything the pools offered, the dream of a life-changing windfall, but faster, simpler, more visible, and backed by the full promotional machinery of a government franchise and a prime-time BBC broadcast. The pools had survived Ramsay MacDonald's denunciation, the Ready Money Football Betting Act, the Pools War of 1936, and 2 world wars. Whether they could survive a competitor that combined the reach of the BBC with the simplicity of a scratch card was a question that kept executives awake in Liverpool, though not, apparently, the 32 family shareholders who were focused on a different set of numbers entirely, because the structural fact that would matter more than any competitor, any technology shift, or any government lottery was the ownership itself. Sir John had transferred most of his shares to family trusts in 1979, distributing ownership across the Moores dynasty. By the early 80s, approximately 32 members of the family held stakes in Littlewoods, 32 shareholders, none with day-to-day involvement in the business, none with their father's feel for the market, his instinct for systems, his understanding of what the women of Liverpool needed and what the men of Britain would bet on. All of them entitled to dividends. And dividends, once Sir John was no longer in the chair to limit them, began to rise. Where Sir John had kept dividend payouts modest, ploughing profits back into the business, the next generation demanded more. They had inherited wealth they hadn't earned, and they wanted the income that went with it. Capital that should have funded a transformation of the catalogue for the digital age, that should have repositioned the stores for the new retail landscape, that should have built the internet platform that would one day become a matter of survival. That capital flowed instead into the private accounts of the Moores family. The company began to age from the inside. Not visibly, not yet, but structurally, like a building whose foundations are subsiding while the facade remains pristine. Sir John had set a rule requiring a 75% supermajority before any shares could be sold to an outsider, designed to keep the company in family hands, a fortress wall against hostile takeover. But the unintended consequence was devastating. Any block of family members who didn't want to sell could block those who did. The company was structurally unable to sell itself, structurally unable to refresh its leadership through outside investment, and structurally incentivized to eat itself alive through the very dividends that kept the family happy. Sir John Moore's probate, when he died, would be valued at £10 million. The Sunday Times Rich List of 1989 had estimated the family's total wealth at £1.7 billion. The gap between those two numbers, 10 million in the estate, 1.7 billion in the family, was the trust structure. It was the very mechanism that had distributed the shares, that had produced the 32 cousins, that had created the dividend expectations, that had built the fortress wall and then locked the occupants inside. The gap between those two numbers was, when you understood it, the whole story of what was about to happen to the largest private company in Europe, But in 1987, none of that was visible. Not to the cameras, not to the crowd, not to the old man in his seat at Wembley, watching the Arsenal captain lift the trophy that bore his company's name. The Littlewoods Cup caught the floodlights and threw them back across a stadium that had no idea it was watching a peak, not a plateau. The fall, when it came, would take 9 years and would be driven not by foreign competition or technological revolution, but by something closer to home, by blood, by inheritance, by the accumulated weight of 32 people who shared a surname and a fortune, but could not agree on what to do with either. Chapter 8. 32 Cousins. Sir John Moores died at Fairways, his home in Freshfield, Formby, on the 25th of September 1993. He was 97 years old. He had outlived his brother Cecil by 4 years, his wife Ruby by many more. A memorial service was held at Liverpool Anglican Cathedral on the 30th of November. A vast, echoing space filled with 2,000 mourners, 1,500 of them Littlewoods employees. His son, John Moores Jr., delivered the eulogy. The women who'd worked the pools floor, the warehouse packers, the store assistants, the canteen staff. They filled the pews of the cathedral as if it were the works canteen on a grander scale. They'd come to say goodbye to Mr. John. What they were also saying goodbye to, though none of them knew it yet, was the company he'd built. The succession had been set in motion months before his death. In April 1993, Sir Desmond Pitcher, the Plessy man who'd served as Group Chief Executive since the early 80s, handed the CEO role to Barry Dale and moved to the non-executive vice-chairmanship. Leonard Van Geest had been chairman since 1990. The structure looked orderly. On paper, it was a textbook transition from founder to professional management. But Sir John's death changed the emotional physics of the boardroom. While he was alive, even in retirement, even at 97, his presence exerted a gravitational pull on the family. He was the reason the company existed. His judgment was the final court of appeal. His values, reinvest, grow, hold, had shaped every major decision for 70 years. Now he was gone, and the 32 family members who inherited his legacy had no such anchor. They were grandchildren, great-nephews, in-laws, cousins, connected by blood and shares but not by any shared vision for what Littlewoods should become. Some wanted to modernise, some wanted to sell, all of them wanted dividends. 13 months after Mr. John's death, on the 14th of November 1994, the National Lottery launched. It was the blow that everyone at Littlewoods had seen coming and no one had been able to prevent. The first draw was broadcast on BBC One to an audience of millions. Anthea Turner smiled. Mystic Meg made her predictions. The numbered balls rolled and bounced and settled. And in living rooms across Britain, the Saturday ritual shifted. The 4 o'clock silence that had belonged to the football results, to the classified cheque, to Dad's coupon on the arm of the chair, was replaced by a Saturday evening spectacle that required no football knowledge, no mathematics, no coupon, no stamp, no waiting. Just a pound and a prayer. The effect on the pools was catastrophic and immediate. Players didn't drift away. They left. 10 million weekly participants in 1994 became a number that shrank every month, every quarter, every year, falling eventually to 700,000 by 2007, a decline of 93%. The Edge Lane Pools building closed that same month, November 1994. The company had seen the lottery coming. The closure was not a surprise to management, even if the speed of the collapse in player numbers exceeded the worst projections. But for the women who worked there, the women who'd spent 10 years or 20 years or 30 years at those long tables, the closure was the end of a world. Several thousand jobs, overwhelmingly women's jobs, overwhelmingly held by women from the terraced streets of Wavertree and Old Swan and Kensington and Bootle, were gone. Some staff were redeployed to other Littlewoods divisions. Many were simply made redundant. They walked out through the Edge Lane gates for the last time and went home to houses where the works hooter had been the morning alarm clock, where the Friday wage packet had been the household's central fact, where the friendships formed on the pool's floor were the friendships of a lifetime. The building that had processed the hopes of 10 million people a week, that had housed wartime code breakers and printed 17 million national registration forms in 3 days, fell silent. The tables were cleared, the trays were stacked. The Joey, the addressograph, the machine whose percussive slamming had rattled the bones of every woman in the building every Wednesday for 50 years, was switched off. The clock tower still overlooked Edge Lane. The white Art Deco facade still faced the traffic heading into Liverpool from the M62, but the floors were empty now, and the silence that settled inside was the particular silence of a place built for noise and inhabited by nothing. Inside the boardroom, the effect of Sir John's death and the lottery's launch combined into something toxic. In October 1994, the deputy CEO was ousted under family pressure. In March 1995, Barry Dale, the man Pitcher had chosen as his successor barely 2 years earlier, was sacked. 2 months later, in May 1995, Pitcher himself resigned. The company was briefly leaderless. Bill Huntley, formerly of Sperry Computer Systems, was brought in as interim CEO, a caretaker in a burning building. In the space of 18 months, Littlewoods had lost its founder, its core revenue stream, its CEO, its deputy CEO, and its most experienced non-executive. The largest private company in Europe was being run by an interim appointment, governed by a fractured family, and hemorrhaging the division that had started it all. The women who'd built the empire, the Littlewoodies, the Pools girls, the canteen singers, and the rubber thumb champions, were walking out through the Edge Lane gates for the last time, carrying their belongings in carrier bags, and nobody in the boardroom was watching. Chapter 9. The bidders at the door. What happened next should have been the rescue. Instead, it became the proof that rescue was impossible, not because the company couldn't be saved, but because the family couldn't agree on whether it should be. In 1995, 2 separate bids emerged, each valued at approximately £1,100,000,000. The first came from Barry Dale himself, the man Littlewoods had just sacked. Dale, backed by venture capital, launched a bid that was equal parts corporate strategy and personal revenge. He'd been fired. He believed the company was mismanaged. He wanted to buy it, restructure it, and prove the family wrong. He had, by all accounts, the backing to do it. Serious money from serious investors who could see the value in a company with $2 billion in annual revenue, 120 stores, and a catalogue operation that still reached a third of British households. The second bid was a joint approach from Malcolm Walker's Iceland Group and the Manchester-based mail-order specialist N. Brown. The plan was surgical, and in retrospect, probably the most rational option available. Iceland, the frozen food chain that Walker had built from a single shop in Oswestry into a national brand, would take the high street stores. N. Brown, specialists in catalogue retail, particularly larger sizes and niche markets, would take the mail order division. Between them, they'd pay the family £1 billion to walk away. The stores would get a retailer who understood high street footfall. The catalogue would get an operator who understood mail order logistics. The family would get their money. Everyone, on paper, would win. Either bid would have valued the Moores family's holding at a price that reflected the company's true scale. Either bid would have brought in outside capital, outside management, outside energy. Either bid might have given Littlewoods a chance to survive the internet age that was about to arrive. The question of whether the company could have been saved is unanswerable in the abstract. What is answerable is this: the family refused to let anyone try. In December 1995, the Moores family voted. The question was not whether to sell Littlewoods. The question was narrower, and in retrospect, more damning. Whether to open the company's books to the bidders, not whether to accept their money, simply whether to let them examine the numbers. Due diligence, the standard first step in any corporate transaction. A procedure so routine that refusing it was, in itself, a statement. A declaration that the family would rather keep the company's affairs private than discover what it was actually worth to someone willing to pay. The vote was 4-1 against. The family, by a decisive margin, refused to let either bidder even look. The fortress wall held. The 32 cousins stayed inside it. And £1.1 billion, 2 separate bids, 2 separate consortia, 2 separate rescue plans, walked away into the Liverpool night and never came back. A partial flotation plan was announced in January 1996. Littlewoods would list a portion of its shares on the stock exchange, allowing family members who wanted out to sell their stakes on the open market while keeping the company nominally private and under family influence. It was a compromise designed to please everyone and therefore certain to please no one. The plan was quietly shelved within months. The family couldn't agree on a price. They couldn't agree on which divisions to float. They couldn't agree on the timetable. They couldn't agree on anything except that the dividends should keep coming and that the outside world should be kept outside. In June 1996, the board recruited a new chairman, James Ross, the former CEO of Cable and Wireless, who'd left that company in November 1995 after losing his own boardroom battle. Ross arrived with assurances of more authority than his predecessors had enjoyed, and with a public statement from the family agreeing to a clear separation between ownership and management issues. Asked by reporters whether Littlewoods would float, Ross was categorical. "We have no intention of floating the company. We have not discussed it with shareholders. It is not even on the agenda." On the pools, he was equally blunt. "I would not describe it as core." It was a remarkable statement. The pools, the original business, the founding idea, the reason the company existed, were no longer core. In a single sentence, James Ross had told Liverpool what the family already knew, but couldn't bring themselves to say. The thing that Mr. John had built with £50 and 35 returned coupons was now an embarrassment to be managed down, not a heritage to be defended. In 1997, Lady Grantchester, Betty Swinson-Taylor, née Moores, Sir John's eldest daughter, the family matriarch, retired from the Littlewoods board. She was 72. The same year, she sold her stake in Everton Football Club to Peter Johnson. The old guard was leaving. The generation that remembered Mr. John, that understood what the company meant to Liverpool, was stepping aside. What replaced them was not vision, it was drift. That same year, Littlewoods sold 19 of its larger stores to Marks & Spencer for £200 million. The stores were prime high street sites, exactly the kind of real estate that M&S was accumulating for its own expansion. It was the first major amputation, and it set a pattern that would repeat for 8 years. Sell the assets, piecemeal, in transactions that valued the parts below what the whole would have fetched, because the whole could never be offered for sale, while the family couldn't agree. £200 million for 19 stores. A year earlier, the family had refused to open the books on a £1.1 billion offer for the entire company. The mathematics of that decision, sell the pieces for less or sell the whole for more, was not complicated. The family chose the less, and a bid for rival mail-order house Freeman's, valued at £370 million, was blocked by the Monopolies and Mergers Commission in November 1997. The company had tried to grow by acquiring a competitor, a strategy that might have given the Catalogue division the scale it needed to survive the digital transition. The government's competition watchdog said no. The company had been offered a £1 billion exit. The family had said no. Now the regulator had blocked the growth strategy. Every door that might have led to survival was closing, one by one, and the people closing them were not enemies. They were the family, the government, and the competitive authorities, each acting within their own logic, none of them responsible for the cumulative effect, all of them contributing to an outcome that left Littlewoods trapped. Chapter 10. Selling the Foundation. Barry Gibson arrived as CEO in September 1997. He was a former BAA Group retail director, paid an estimated £700,000 a year, and he represented the last serious attempt to run Littlewoods as a going concern. Gibson understood retail. He understood restructuring. What he couldn't overcome was the ownership structure that made every strategic decision a negotiation with 32 people who couldn't agree on lunch. The most devastating single moment in the decline of Littlewoods, the beat that, more than any other, captures the tragedy of what the family did to their inheritance, came on the 4th of September 2000. On that date, the Moores family sold the Littlewoods Football Pools division to Rodeem plc. The name Rodeem meant nothing to anyone in Liverpool. It meant nothing to anyone in football. It meant nothing to anyone in the betting industry, or the retail trade, or the wider world of British commerce. Rodeem was a moribund hard disk drive manufacturer based in Scotland. A shell company, effectively dormant, its share price measured in fractions of a penny, part owned by the Bank of Scotland and kept alive primarily as a vehicle for future transactions. It had no connection to gambling, no connection to sport, no connection to anything that John Moores had ever built. The deal was masterminded by businessman Trevor Hemmings, a Lancashire-born property magnate and racehorse owner who saw the pools as an asset worth restructuring. The price was £161.8 million. Redim promptly renamed itself Sportec. Consider that number, £161.8 million, for the business that John Moores had founded with £50 in 1923, for the game that 10 million people a week had played at its peak, for the treble chance, for the Saturday silence, for the coupon on the arm of the chair and the classified results read out on grandstand, for the Joey and the rubber thumbs and the women of Edge Lane, for 77 years of unbroken operation. 1 million people still played each week at the time of the sale, diminished certainly from the peak, but far from dead. The pools were still a going concern, and the family that owned them sold them to a company that made hard discs. The Observer's city editor, Paul Farrelly, published a piece on the 17th of September 2000 titled Littlewoods' Catalogue of Disasters. The Financial Times ran Lucy Kilgren's Littlewoods under scrutiny the same month. The press could see what was happening. The family apparently could not, or would not. The figures told the story in the language the boardroom understood. Pre-tax profit collapsed from £54.4 million to £18.9 million on flat turnover of £1.9 billion for the year to the 30th of April 2001. The decline wasn't gradual, it was a cliff. A company that had generated £100 million in annual profits at its peak was now struggling to clear £20 million, barely enough to service the dividend expectations of the family shareholders, let alone fund the transformation that the business desperately needed. In July 2001, 250 head office jobs were axed in Liverpool. The company was shrinking in every direction. Fewer staff, fewer stores, fewer customers, fewer reasons to believe that the trajectory could be reversed. The catalogue was losing market share to the internet. The stores were losing footfall to out-of-town competitors. The pools were a shadow of what they'd been, and the family shareholders, who had refused to sell at £1.1 billion, were watching their inheritance diminish quarter by quarter. On the 24th of September 2001, 1 year and 20 days after the pools had been sold to a hard disk company, Barry Gibson was ousted. Corporate Services Director Jim Donovan delivered the public statement, and it was a masterpiece of boardroom euphemism. The board decided that they wanted a change of leadership. In many ways, he has done a fantastic job. He is an agent of change. But the board decided they wanted a fresh face in the job to take the business forward. A fantastic job, a fresh face. The language of human resources applied to the dismantling of an empire. Gibson's replacement was Alistair McGeorge, a chartered accountant who joined Littlewoods in 1994 as finance director of home shopping and risen through the supply chain. He was promoted to CEO from supply chain director on the same day Gibson was fired. The same day, James Ross announced he would leave the chairmanship at the end of April 2002. David Simons would take over as chairman. In the space of 7 years, from Sir John's death in September 1993 to the sale of the pools in September 2000, the Moores family had lost the founding division, cycled through 4 CEOs, rejected £2 billion bids, and watched the company's profits collapse by 2/3. The women of Edge Lane were long gone. The boardroom was a revolving door, and the family, having refused to sell at £1.1 billion, were about to sell for considerably less. Chapter 11. The Twins from Brecco. The buyers, when they finally came, were a pair of men as reclusive and as twinned as the story demands. They were not saviours. They were not rescuers. They were buyers of distressed assets, and Littlewoods was a distressed asset. Sir David and Sir Frederick Barclay were born on the 27th of October 1934, 10 minutes apart, in Hammersmith, West London. Their father was a Scottish travelling salesman who died when the boys were 12, leaving them, like John Moores before them, to make their own way from nothing. They left school at 16, worked in the accounts department at GEC, the General Electric Company, then became painters and decorators, then property investors, then hotel owners, then media magnates, then billionaires. Identical twins, they dressed alike, spoke alike, and operated as a single commercial intelligence inhabiting 2 bodies. They purchased the tiny Channel island of Brecco outright and built upon it a Gothic castle, complete with a helicopter pad, from which they ran their empire with a privacy so total that photographs of them were rarer than photographs of reclusive dictators. They owned the Ritz Hotel in Piccadilly. They owned the Scotsman newspaper in Edinburgh. They would soon add the Daily Telegraph to the collection. Their business model, refined across 4 decades, was consistent. Buy distressed or undermanaged assets, strip costs to the bone, leverage with debt, root ownership through offshore trusts in Jersey, Guernsey, and the Cayman Islands, and operate behind a wall of corporate opacity that made investigation nearly impossible and accountability entirely optional. On Friday, the 4th of October 2002, the Moores family sold Littlewoods to Sir David and Sir Frederick Barclay for £750 million. The bid vehicle was called LW Investments, chaired by Aidan Barclay, Sir David's son, then 46. The deal was bankrolled by HBOS, the banking group, which took a 5% equity stake. Of the approximately 40 family shareholders, 71% voted to approve the sale. Just enough. Sir John's original 75% supermajority rule had apparently been amended at some point in the late 90s, or the 71% figure was just above whatever the amended threshold required. Either way, the vote was close. Nearly a third of the family voted against selling. They were outvoted by cousins who wanted out, who wanted their cash, who had spent 9 years watching the company shrink and the dividends diminish and the CEO carousel spin. David Simons, the chairman, released a statement. The Moores family are pleased to have sold Littlewoods to another private family company with similar values. Similar values. The Barclays, offshore trusts, asset stripping, Gothic castles on private islands, and the Moores, penny coupons, women's wages, the best pay in Liverpool. Similar values. Philip Green, the Arcadia retail tycoon, offered his assessment of the company the Barclays had just acquired. His verdict was widely circulated in the trade press. Littlewoods couldn't run a bath. An unnamed associate of the Barclays told the Liverpool Daily Post, "People get the Barclays wrong by always assuming there is some grand plan or conspiracy. Often they just buy things to stop themselves getting bored." The family had owned Littlewoods for 79 years. The company their father had founded with £50 and a packet of coupons, that had employed 30,000 people, that had sent catalogues to 1 in 3 British households, that had paid the best wages in Liverpool for 3 generations. The family had sold it for £750 million, split 40 ways, not quite 20 million each on average, for the largest private company in Europe. The Moores name left the building. It would not return. The building stayed where it was, and the silence that settled inside it grew deeper with every year that followed. Chapter 12. The stripping. The Barclays moved quickly. In 2003, they acquired Shop Direct, the home shopping arm spun out of Great Universal Stores, which included the K's, Great Universal, Choice, and Marshall Ward Catalogue brands, and merged it with Littlewoods to create Littlewoods Shop Direct Group. Distribution centres in Worcester, Leeds, Eccles, and Wigan were closed. The logic was consolidation. 2 catalogue businesses merged into one, with the duplicated infrastructure stripped out. The human cost was measured in hundreds of warehouse jobs across 4 towns, each closure announced in the same corporate language of operational efficiency and strategic alignment. In 2004, the Widney's call centre was shut. In February 2005, plans were announced to relocate the home shopping business and 1,500 staff from Crosby, where Littlewoods had operated since the war years, to a new site in Netherton. The geography of the company was being redrawn, pulled away from the Liverpool neighbourhoods where the Littlewoodies had walked to work for generations, relocated to sites chosen for their cost efficiency rather than their connection to the workforce. Then, in April 2005, came the blow that shook what remained of the Littlewoods identity to its foundations. The Index catalogue chain, Littlewoods' in-store catalogue shop concept, 126 outlets across Britain, was closed, every single one. 33 were sold to Gus-owned Argos for £44 million. The rest simply shut their doors. 3,200 jobs were lost. John Gall, the USDAW national officer, spoke to the press with a fury that the measured union language barely contained. The long history of Littlewoods means there are many long-serving and loyal employees at Index who now face the prospect of losing their jobs. This decision has come completely out of the blue. Our members, who have contributed to the success of this company, have been left reeling and utterly shocked by this devastating news. This is another step in the demise of Littlewoods as a premier employer. The phrase, completely out of the blue, carried a particular cruelty. The index chain had not made a profit in 18 of its 20 years of existence. It had been running at an annual loss of £100 million. Management knew it was failing. The Barclays knew it was failing. But the workers who staffed it, many of them women who'd transferred from the pool's floor or the mail-order warehouse, women who'd been with Littlewoods for 20 or 30 years, had not been told it was failing. They'd been told nothing at all. They arrived for work one morning and were told their jobs no longer existed. 3,200 people. Out of the blue. There were no strikes, no marches, no dramatic standoffs at the factory gates. The workforce was too dispersed across 126 separate outlets, too shocked, too resigned. By 2005, the women who'd once been the core of the largest private company in Europe had learned the lesson that the boardroom had been teaching them for a decade. Loyalty flows one way. 3 months later, on the 11th of July 2005, the final act of the retail dismemberment was completed. Associated British Foods, the parent company of Primark, bought all 120 remaining Littlewoods stores for £409 million. About 40 were converted to Primark outlets. The rest were sold on to Marks & Spencer, New Look and BHS. George Weston, the ABF chief executive, called the estate close to unique and noted that estates like this don't come up very often. He was right. They don't. They take 70 years to build and an afternoon to sell. 2,500 store staff entered a period of transition, the corporate euphemism for redundancy with a notice period. Some would find jobs in the Primark stores that replaced the Littlewoods fascias. Many would not. Primark's wage structure and staffing model were different from what Littlewoods had offered, leaner and less generous, built for a fast fashion retailer rather than a mid-market department store. 270 Liverpool head office staff were made redundant outright. The city that had been the company's home since 1923, the city where Mr. John had handed out his first coupons, built his first office, opened his first warehouse, employed 30,000 people at peak, was losing its connection to the company it had made. Councillor Joe Anderson, then the opposition Labour leader on Liverpool City Council, told the press, "It's very disappointing given what I felt were assurances that the office and shops in Liverpool would be safe with the takeover." Councillor Mike Story, the council leader, was blunter. "Clearly it's a body blow for Liverpool and Merseyside. It comes as a shock when it affects the lives of so many people." In March 2006, the last Littlewoods store closed its doors. The name that had been on the British High Street since the 6th of July 1937, since the first store in Blackpool, since Mr. John had decided that pools and catalogues weren't enough, that he wanted shop fronts too, vanished. 65 years of retail presence ended. The fascias came down, the Primark signs went up, and Liverpool, the city that Littlewoods had employed more than any other, watched another piece of its industrial inheritance carried away. The head office moved from the Sir John Moores building on Old Hall Street, an 18-storey, 213-foot tower at number 100, to Spinney House on Church Street just before Christmas 2004. By 2005, the successor company was headquartered at Skyway's house on Speke Road, Speke, a £31 million renovated former aircraft hangar at Liverpool's southern edge, miles from the central streets, where John Moores had handed out his first coupons. The geography said everything. The company had retreated from the city that built it. In 2008, the original Littlewoods company was formally wound up. The name Littlewoods was dropped from the corporate title. Littlewoods Shop Direct became simply Shop Direct Group. The word that had been on the coupons since 1923, on the catalogue since 1932, on the stores since 1937, on the Edge Lane building since 1938, the word that was really a man's unused birth name, chosen for anonymity by 3 clerks who couldn't afford to be caught, was retired. 4,000 jobs disappeared as an organisational entity, even if many workers transferred to the new Shop Direct structure. They were no longer Littlewoodies. They were Shop Direct employees working for a company that had no memory of Mr. John, no connection to the pools, no roots in the streets of Liverpool where the women had walked to work for 60 years. The redundancies, totalled up, formed their own devastating arithmetic. November 1994, several thousand pools workers at Edge Lane. July 2001, 250 head office staff. 2003 to 2004, Hundreds of warehouse jobs in Worcester, Leeds, Eccles, Wigan and the Widnes call centre. April 2005, 3,200 at Index. July 2005 to March 2006, 2,500 store staff in transition, 270 Liverpool head office staff made redundant. 2008, 4,000 jobs eliminated as a corporate entity, from a peak of 30,000 to a successor company of 4,000, and the 4,000 working in a former aircraft hangar in Speke, miles from the central Liverpool streets where John Moores had rented his first office on Church Street, a lifetime ago. Chapter 13. The Catalogue burns. The Catalogue, the wish book, the thing that had started it all in January 1932, the thick paper Bible of working-class aspiration, held on longer than anyone expected, long after the stores were gone, long after the pools had been sold to a hard disk company, long after the Moores family had taken their $750 million and scattered. The Littlewoods catalogue continued to land on doormats across Britain, thinner now, less frequent, competing with websites that could show you the same products instantly, let you order with a click, deliver next day, but still there, still printed, still posted. In May 2015, the last printed Littlewoods catalogue was published, 300,000 copies, from a peak of 25 million. The print run itself was a measure of decline so steep that no graph could make it look like anything other than a collapse, from 1 in 3 British households to a niche product serving a customer base that was aging out of the market with every passing year. The company said customers had migrated to digital platforms. Migration is a word that implies choice, that implies movement towards something better. What had actually happened was that the world had moved on, and the catalogue, that Victorian social technology of agents and clubs and weekly payments and brown paper parcels, the wish book that children traced with tracing paper at Christmas, the thing that had been hidden under sofa cushions in November so the presents would be a surprise, had been left behind. The agents were retired or dead. The club system that had sustained working-class credit for 60 years had been replaced by credit cards and online accounts. The woman at number 47 no longer collected on Fridays. There was nothing left to collect for. On the 26th of June 2017, Sportec, the company that had once been Rodeem, the hard disk shell that had bought the pools for $161.8 million, sold the football pools to Op Capita's acquisition vehicle, FP Acquisitions Limited, for £83 million cash. The pools had lost half their value in 17 years. The business that 10 million people had played each week, that had built the largest private company in Europe, that had provided the best wages in Liverpool for 3 generations, was sold for the price of a mid-table Premier League footballer. And then the building burned. On the evening of the 2nd of September 2018, a fire broke out in the west wing of the Edge Lane Pools building. The building had stood empty for 24 years, a quarter of a century of silence, of broken windows and pigeon roosts and the slow decay of concrete and plaster and the geometric Art Deco motifs that Gerald de Courcy Fraser had designed to last. Over 50 firefighters in 6 engines fought the blaze for 12 hours through the night. Internal temperatures reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. The roof of the west wing collapsed first, then the upper floor, the same floor where the women had sat at their long tables checking coupons, where the Joey had hammered its rhythm every Wednesday, where the rubber thumbs had moved in a blur of paper and ink. The structure that had survived the Luftwaffe's bombing of Liverpool, that had housed the wartime censorship operation and printed 17 million forms in 3 days, was gutted by a fire that Merseyside police would later classify as arson. Someone, unnamed, unidentified, uncaught, had set fire to the Dream Factory, the clock tower, Fraser's clock tower, the one that had kept time for the district since 1938, the landmark visible across the rooftops of East Liverpool, the symbol of the company itself, was dismantled in the weeks that followed. Structurally unsafe. It was lowered to the ground in sections, the clock face that had overlooked the morning shift arriving and the evening shift departing, laid flat on the concrete, like a body on a slab. Joe Anderson, by then the mayor of Liverpool, called it heartbreaking. The word was precise. The building was the heart of the story, and someone had set fire to it. The painted portraits in the basement bomb shelters survived. The MC5 faces, the wartime men and women in their helmets, painted by hands that might have forged enemy letters the same afternoon, were below the fire line. The basement was untouched. The portraits stared out from the concrete, as they'd stared since 1940, unaware that the building above them had been gutted. They endured. The clock did not. Chapter 14. The Hollywood of the North. What remains is complicated. Not nothing, not enough, but not nothing. The Edge Lane building, or what survived the fire, is being slowly converted into a film studio complex. Capital and Centric, the development company fronted by John Moffat, announced the plan in June 2018, 3 months before the arson. The fire changed the scope, but not the ambition. A £70 million regeneration, backed by £17 million from the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority, under Mayor Steve Rotherham, supported by Twickenham Studios and Liverpool John Moores University, was approved by Liverpool City Council in 2024. The first phase, the depot, opened in October 2021. Completion is targeted for 2027. The building will make films instead of checking coupons. Whether that constitutes redemption or replacement depends on who you ask. The Littlewoods Heritage Project at Liverpool John Moores University has done what the company itself never did, preserved the memory of what happened inside those walls. Led by Dr. Ruth Doughty of the Liverpool Screen School, supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Capital and Centric, the project digitised archives, captured oral histories on film, and produced an animated short, above all, inside the Littlewoods Dream Factory. A major exhibition ran at the Museum of Liverpool on the Pierhead into mid-2024. Joan Boyce's book sits in Liverpool libraries. The Littlewoods Football Pools collection is held at the National Football Museum in Manchester. The testimony exists. The women spoke. Someone wrote it down. The Moores family dispersed into the lives that wealth provides. Sir John Moores Jr. served as the second Chancellor of Liverpool John Moores University and bred Aberdeen Angus cattle at his Formby farm until his death in 2012. Sir Peter Moores, the philanthropist, founded the Peter Moores Foundation and championed opera at Compton Verney in Warwickshire until he died in 2016. Lady Grantchester, Betty, Sir John's eldest daughter, the family matriarch who'd retired from the board in 1997, died in 2019. David Moores, Sir John's nephew, was chairman of Liverpool Football Club from 1991 to 2007. He sold to American owners Tom Hicks and George Gillett in a deal that turned bitter, another Moores sale that ended in recrimination. The current Lord Grantchester sits in the House of Lords as a Labour peer. The family name carries weight in Liverpool. The family company does not exist. The Very Group, the digital retailer that evolved from Shop Direct, headquartered at Skyway's house in Speke, employs approximately 4,000 people. On the 10th of November 2025, the Carlyle Group completed its acquisition of The Very Group. The Barclay family exited. 23 years after buying Littlewoods for $750 million, the Barclays' successors sold what remained of the Catalogue empire to an American private equity firm. The cycle was complete. A family business sold to a private family, sold to private equity, the name surviving only as a website URL. Walk along Edge Lane at dusk, and you'll see the building. What's left of it? The West Wing restored beneath scaffolding, the construction hoarding covered with promotional images of the studio complex to come. The clock tower is gone. The space where it stood is visible as an absence, a gap in the roofline where the most recognisable feature of the most recognisable industrial building in Liverpool used to be. The murals on the surviving pavilions, painted in May 2016, celebrating Liverpool's creative industries, face the traffic heading into the city from the motorway. They're bright, bold, contemporary. They cover a building that is nearly 90 years old and has been empty for more than 30 of them. Inside, somewhere in the basement, the painted portraits survive. The MC5 faces on the bomb shelter walls, the wartime men and women staring out from the concrete with expressions that have outlasted everything above them. The pools operation, the coupons, the company, the family, the clock. In a museum case elsewhere in Liverpool, the addressograph sits silent. The Joey, the percussive, almost violent machine that printed millions of envelopes a week, that the women compared to being bombed, that shook the building every Wednesday for half a century. It sits where industrial things sit when they stop being industrial. Behind glass, with a label, with a photograph alongside it of women whose names are now recorded in Joan Boyce's book, and in the oral histories that Ruth Doughty's team captured on film, before the memories faded and the voices fell silent for good. A bricklayer's son from Eccles built the largest private company in Europe on a £50 bet and a wife's encouragement. For 70 years, his Littlewoodies, tens of thousands of Liverpool women, checked coupons, packed parcels, filled envelopes with rubber thumbs, sang in the canteen at lunchtime, and held together the credit economy of working-class Britain. They were paid the best wages in the city. They were given paid holidays and sports teams and seaside trips and a building with a clock tower that kept time for the district. And then Mr. John died, and his 32 heirs spent 9 years arguing about what to do with what he'd left them, and then they voted 71% to sell to 2 reclusive billionaires on a private island, and within 4 years there was nothing left but a Primark, an empty Art Deco palace, and a website. The catalogue is gone. The pools are gone. The stores are gone. The women are gone, retired, redundant, scattered across Merseyside with their memories and their carrier bags. What remains is a building being turned into a film studio, a book of oral histories, a painted portrait on a bomb shelter wall, and the silence left behind by a machine called the Joey that no one will ever hear again.